Hello and welcome to Language, Culture, and Dr. Lou. And in this video, I want to talk about some pretty popular phrases and sayings that surprisingly um, have their beginnings in the military. And some are more obvious than others. Um, but I got into putting this little collection together because I've been doing, well, other videos about the origins of sayings and idiomatic expressions, and I found those ended up including ones like "bite the bullet," which is sadly with military wartime origins. Let's say you're having surgery in the field and there's no anesthesia, you're biting on a lead bullet to make it not well to be able to cope with the pain. And so that's a pretty upsetting one, and same as the whole 9 yards. And so you might want to go into some of those videos to check out the more disturbing military origins of sayings. But for now, let's keep it yeah, a little more fun than that. And so the first one I'd like to mention is called avant-garde. Well, I think in English, avant-garde, we usually say from this French avant-garde, which just means the forefront. And well, that's how we use it today anyway, to mean the forefront. And so we're often talking about if a fashion designer is really at the forefront of fashion and pushing fashion forward. We could call them very avant-garde or part of the avant-garde. And what the avant-garde really was in the French military was, if you think of it this way, the guard was the main body of troops, the main body of soldiers. Like, let's say you're maybe going to go into a battle. But before you do, you have the avant-garde, a little party of soldiers, a smaller group of them who go ahead and check things out and plan a course of action pretty much. They just check things out. They're like, let's call them little scouts ahead of the main group of soldiers. And so hopefully they find everything out all right and are able to come back and rejoin the other soldiers and help them have a good plan of attack, pretty much. So that's the avant garde, which, of course, in English, just avant garde. And although now we apply it very often to fashion and the arts, such as music and visual arts. And we also might apply it to a politician who is really championing a certain brand new movement. But it was about wartime and scoping things out before getting into the battle, pretty much. And so the next one is a little more surprising and far more explosive. Bikini. You know that the original bikini, excuse me, um, well, the modern bikini as we know it today was designed in 1946, came out in 1946 by a designer named Louis Rayard. And so this was in part the result why a bikini, he designed this two-piece swimsuit. And part of this was because of World War II materials rationing. Like you use a whole lot less fabric if you have a two-piece suit instead of a one-piece. And so it does tie into World War II a little bit for that. And why did he call it the bikini? Because he thought he wanted his new two-piece swimsuit to be just as explosive and fasten and have a word that's just as explosive um, as his new design would be for fashion. And so, what's with the bikini meaning explosive? Bikini Atoll was, well, an island in the Pacific where the US in 1946, the same year the bikini was going to be coming out, where we were doing atom bombs testing. We were dropping atomic bombs on this island. And so this designer knew about that and he figured, okay, really explosive name for my really explosive new design. And yeah, so it all ties into World War II and sadly even the A bomb. Uh, and so this next one is also pretty disappointing and also about a bomb, and that is a blockbuster. Of course, these days we use the word blockbuster to describe a box office hit, a movie that's super successful. But originally, it meant something much, much worse. Originally, a blockbuster, it was a bomb that you could drop from the sky, and it was a bomb that was big enough to take out an entire city block. And I guess, well, yeah, as for example, look at the size of the bomb next to that girl in the picture there. Um, and so that's what a blockbuster was originally. It's a bomb designed to, yeah, take out a whole city block. So, yeah, also pretty explosive, but not quite to the extent of Bikini. But hey, do a lot of local destruction with a blockbuster. And so the next one will be a little less modern, because this one goes all the way back to the Civil War. Um, and so during the Civil War, there was we this word deadline ended up being invented. And what was the deadline? Sadly enough, it was about prisoners in the war camp. And it originally started at camp, one military camp, and actually spread and happened in other military camps around where they would square in all of the prisoners into one area denoted in the shape of a square or maybe even a rectangle. And the boundaries of the whole thing were called the deadline. And the thing is, the threat was if any of the prisoners tried to cross the deadline, they would get shot. Um, and so, yeah, it it was very literal deadline. If you cross this line, you will be dead. And so, yeah, it's from the American Civil War, and it was literally about death at the time. So that's pretty depressing. And before we move on to some uh, expressions, some phrases that have their origins in the Navy, I'll do one final one having to do with, well, fighting on land. And to run amok, we use the term to run amok for to go wild, to start doing unpredictable behaviors, ignoring the rules. So to go wild is to run amok. This came from when Europeans first made their way into Malaysia in the 18th century and then continued exploring in the 19th century. Um, they came across, there were several classes of warriors in Malaysia. And one of these classes of warriors were called the Amuka. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it, but Amuca is how it's spelled. Were the Amuka warriors, and so those guys had this belief that if they lost a battle, that losing a battle that would bring them afterwards, they would be shamed, be punished with dishonor and even death. So because they were fearing for their own lives, especially that, translated in some pretty outlandish tactics in battle and pretty outlandish behavior, and so we called them running amok. And so that's what that term was all about. So now let's move on to stuff that's a little less depressing, because not everything military has to be super upsetting, like the better end. Of course, we do use this term these days to mean something upsetting, the bitter end. I think of people saying, oh, they're going to be fighting until the bitter end. And so, yeah, bitterness seems yeah, pretty strong emotion and pretty sad, but really this originally didn't mean anything sad at all. It was coined by a naval captain named John Smith, who I think it was 1627 was when he wrote his publication called Seaman's Grammar. And so he described, he coined this term bitter end. So what, and simply put, the a bit itself would be a peg on the deck of a ship that you wrap rope around, right? And so then the bitter end, if a rope is pulled out until the bitter end, that means there's no more rope left to use. So that is how he was describing this was yeah, it's the bitter end, that would be the end. There's no more rope to be used after that. And ropes are very important on ships. They do a lot of things. And these days, we can also use bitter end, which is also a part on a ship, as the better end for an anchor chain or an anchor rope. That we also call that. So it could be even on a smaller boat. And so, yeah, that came from a naval captain originally, and it was just about those bits and the rope that you wind around them on the ship. And so, speaking of the Navy, that's also where the term cup of Joe came from. And this goes way back to just pre Prohibition era, um, where the US Secretary of the Navy didn't want any alcohol to be served on any more naval ships, and any more boats. And so the strongest, and he put a memo forth in, yeah, 1913. And so the strongest drink available on a naval ship after that was coffee. And it was on those Navy ships that a cup of coffee uh, got to be really liked, and also got to be known as a cup of Joe. So that's where we got the term cup of Joe from, was naval soldiers not being able to drink alcohol and just being able to drink coffee. That's the strongest thing they could get. That was the cup of Joe. And so, what's funny is this was 1913, and prohibition itself, those laws didn't go into effect until about 1920. I think it was the early 1920s that were prohibition, and this was even well before that, before World War One would even come to an end or anything, and already the, yeah, American Navy wanted no more alcohol on the ships. And so, feeling blue, this one, yeah, we're going back to something kind of sad, because we talked about feeling blue today. We mean feeling sadness. I'm feeling upset. I'm feeling sad about something if I'm feeling blue. And this also came from the Navy. When a naval ship would lose its captain or another really high ranking officer, they would fly blue flags on their way home. On their return home, they would fly blue flags and paint a blue band around the hull of the ship. And so this blue was very literal blue, and it was for a pretty sad occasion when the ship had lost its captain, that's a pretty sad occasion. And it used to be actually about feeling blue, um, and seeing blue from the flags and the whole of the ship and all that. So that one's a little, yeah, more disappointing, although the next one, not so bad. And so speaking of ships, when you have a ship that sails through, wind and all that, that uses masts and sails and all that, there are a lot of ropes involved on a ship. And so today we use the term to know the ropes as to have expertise in something. We're talking about someone who really knows their stuff if they know the ropes. And of course, that started out as something literal. Um, with when a sailor would get their discharge papers, it would say right on it that they know the ropes, because that was just an indication that they had learned all their basic knowledge of the names of the different ropes on the ships and what are their purposes, and how to use them, and so on and so on. So it was a way to show that a sailor did indeed have their basic knowledge that they would need to be productive on the ship. And so that's where know the ropes comes from. And these days we can use it in any number of fields, any number of lines of work, or even leisure activities. If you really know what you're doing there, you really know the ropes. And it's not just for sailors anymore, but that's where it came from. And this next one, being a loose cannon, if someone or something is super unpredictable, maybe even volatile, not safe to engage with, we call that person a loose cannon or that thing a loose cannon. And this originally came from President Theodore Roosevelt, when he mentioned how he didn't want to be an old cannon, an old cannon loose on a ship deck during a storm. Um, or maybe he mentioned loose on a ship deck during choppy seas, one or the other. So it came from him, and what he talking about was before we had actually turret guns welded right into the ships that were really attached there. We had these cannons that were not built into the ships. They were actually would roll around on wheels and things like that. And so if a ship goes into turbulent seas during a big storm or something like that, sometimes a cannon could get loose and roll around and really harm the sailors, really harm everybody on the ship, maybe even damage some things in the property, because we're talking about really heavy machinery there. And imagine if it's rolling around, seeming to have a mind of its own as the ship is rocking. Anyway, so that's where we get the expression loose cannon from, and that is thanks to Theodore Roosevelt, actually, the teddy bear guy. Yeah, and it was a real danger at one time, during a storm on a ship, that a loose cannon might come along and just crush you. Anyway, so that's a little scary. This next one is not so bad though. And this will be, I think, the final phrase that I have for today. To be taken aback by something, that's when we're just, very surprised and maybe even a little bewildered and like, hey, I'm not quite sure how to handle this yet. You're taken aback. This is a bad thing. And so, how did we get to use this term this way? Because to be taken aback had nautical origins, and it's about a ship in the wind. And so, if a ship is taken aback, of course, that means the wind is coming towards them from the front. So, that's not a good way to move forward if you're trying to sail. And What being taken aback means is that the wind is blowing so hard that it's pushing the sails up back up against the masts. And that right there is it can be a dangerous thing because then the masts might will be in danger of breaking off and all that. And so you don't want to be stranded at sea because you have no more mast for your sails. Anyway, so that's what taking aback comes from. And so I do have plenty more of these um, if you want. And I didn't want to include them all in this first video because I didn't want it to last several hours long. But if people do respond to this video, if it gets a lot of likes or a lot of watches, I'll be happy to put out some more of these phrases that come from the military. And many of them are pretty surprising that I didn't know came from the military. Other ones that are a little more obvious, but hey. And so thank you so much for watching this video, and please do give it a thumbs up, maybe even add some comments if you know any other popular phrases that come from the military. I'd love to hear them. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do consider subscribing. I would really appreciate that so much. And so my very next video is going to be some more fun words du jour. So I will be starting to work on that pretty soon. Well, in a few minutes actually. So until then, catch you around next time. Bye bye.